Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist of the upcoming graphic novel, A Guest in the House. It's Emily Carroll. Thanks for coming on, Emily.
Hi, thank you for having me.
How is your day starting so far?
Good. I'm all set up. I went out and got my coffee already. I've got a giant jug of water to drink. I'm all set to talk.
Don't drink it too prolifically. That could be detrimental to the interview experience.
Myself.
So you said before we started recording that you haven't done one of these in a while. Are you not in like the midst of the A Guest in the House media blitz?
No, not really. I also just don't do a lot of interviews and things like that. I sort of like to not keep in the shadows, I guess, but I'm fine with people just like, interacting with the work and taking whatever meaning they want from it, with me not having to be a part of it at all. So like, I haven't done an interview in a long time. So like, I think the last time was probably in 2019 was the last time, because that was the last time I had a book out. And then the intervening time I made this book. So like, yeah, it's it's been a while.
Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense because isn't one of like the fundamentals of horror ambiguity? Do you really want to have an interview where you're like, let's dig into the roots and the everything that went into this and the ending and all this stuff like that?
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I definitely want to like avoid that kind of thing. And yeah, I don't know. It hasn't, like I say, it just hasn't really come up. Nobody's really asked for a ton of interviews in the past few years. I mean, there's been a lot of other stuff going on.
Famously.
So understandable. But yeah, no, happy to. It's like this will be interesting for me because it'll be the first time I'm really talking about my work for a while, but also this book at all. So,
well, we're gonna go way back before we get into that. So it's gonna be stuff you've talked about before. But I actually read in an interview where you said that going all the way back to like influences and things like that, that you were a lot more influenced by children's books and fairy tales, not necessarily just other comics. And that was a while ago. I mean, like, I think that was like in 2010 or something like that.
Oh, God. Yeah, I mean, that was certainly true then, because that was like all my comics at that time and my first comics, because I started making comics in 2010. They were all like fairy tale inspired. Like my first book from like 10 years ago now, Through the Woods, is all fairy tale inspired, children's book inspired stuff. And so yeah, like that the layouts and the pages in that book are much more based on like children's books that I read as a kid, or the cadence of children's books. And I mean that's not to say that I wasn't influenced by comics. Like I've been reading comics since I was a child, as one does. But I think I had a thing, and I've talked about this before, but I always had a concern that when it came to comics that I couldn't personally make comics because I didn't know the rules of, what the protocol was for making comics, like how the panels or grids worked, or, this and that. So I think when I started making my own, I came at it from an off angle of doing web comics, and then when I did do paper comics, when I did start doing paper comics, I came at them from the angle of like, I'm going to draw this as like, each page will be like a holistic image. Like Through the Woods is very much like that. Like there's panels in it. And I did, in my work now, I do more panels, but like in that book, I really wanted to make like each page was itself like one big illustration that had different things going on in it. So in that way, it was much more inspired by children's books. But I also was like, as a kid, really spooked by a lot of children's books. And so like the horror element, I think, came from that. Like, obviously the major one is scary stories to tell in the dark. That's obviously terrifying. Those drawings are terrifying, the Stephen Gamble drawings. But there were others, like more cartoony ones. That same author did another children's book. But in Through the Woods, like Goodnight Moon, that book inspired a story in there, because that children's book really scared me as a kid. And even like Dr. Seuss stuff scared me as a kid. I was just scared a lot as a kid, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And like, so I think that influenced the children's book thing.
I feel like there's a real reason why Tim Burton has an affinity for Dr. Seuss, and it's because like there is like an inherent creepiness to it that no one really, I mean, I don't know if no one really talks about it. You clearly just talked about it. There's a little creepiness there, but
there was one story in particular. We had those big, like we had big treasury, Dr. Seuss treasuries, and I could always tell where this story was in the treasury because all the pages were dark, because it all took place at night. And I remember even when opening the treasury to read it as a kid, I would make sure to skip that like chunk of pages, like they were cursed somehow. And it was the story about like this little animal guy who's picking berries or something at night, and a pair of pants starts chasing him. Do you know this one?
No, but that's horrifying.
A pair of jogging pants, like a pair of sweatpants, starts chasing him through the night, through like the woods. And at the end, the pants are more scared of him than he's scared of the pants or whatever. But it's so scary, just like an empty pair of pants. Anyway, but like that feeling of like, there's something physically about that, like, stretch of pages that I can see in the book. Like that's, I think when I started making books myself, I really wanted them to make objects that like, might inspire a similar thing.
Well, job well done. I'll just say
Thank
that.
you.
Spoilers for later. But I want to point out something. Nobody can see this, so this is bad podcasting. But there's a trophy right there. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes.
Yeah, that is what I got for reading 500 books when I was in elementary school.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. This is my humble brag. Now I'm going to move on. But the funny thing is I read obviously a lot of books, but one of the books I read was now I've spaced the name, the Stephen Campbell illustrated
Scary
one.
Stories to Tell in the Dark.
I read that book once, and then I was like, I don't need any more of this genre for like the rest of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they're great. And I think because they released them with a different illustrator for a while, and the illustrations were good, but they weren't that like nightmarish, like graphite, terrifying drawings. And I think they re-released them when the movie came out.
I do think it's interesting though, because another thing I read was that a lot of your early writing, when you were like really trying to like properly write, you were writing tabletop RPG like campaigns and stuff like that for your friends.
Yeah, that was when I was a teenager. Yeah.
I know, but the funny thing about that though is like I feel like that's a super powerful influence. I feel like that type of experience is like when it's not just you, it's like interactive in the same way that horror is. Like I kind of feel like those things like that combined with your comic influences, obviously, and all those things like that. I know you read Junji Ito, and I know that there's a bunch of stuff that is like really impactful for you. But it's like when you kind of make that all into a stew, that kind of turns into, I don't know, I could see that type of stuff in your work. And it's interesting to read about that and then to hear you say like the holistic images and everything like that, because I feel like I've only played Dungeons and Dragons once, and it's the only tabletop RPG I've played. But one of the things I've always noticed from like the Dungeon Master experience is like you need to like read the room and you need to read the experience and everything like that.
Right.
A lot of it kind of comes down to flow. And that's one thing I think is really interesting about your work is whether it's A Guest in the House or Through the Woods, or the short box book was Beneath the Dead Oak Tree.
Mm-hmm.
Those are so flow oriented. It feels like it's all about storytelling flow and also how like everything moves across the page and connects. Are those things you think of a lot as a storyteller?
I mean, that's interesting to hear and flattering because, yeah, like just to go back to tabletop games, and this does tie in, I haven't really connected this before. As a storyteller, so I was like 17, 18, 19 when I did this.
We're going way back.
But I did run one modified Dungeons and Dragons game, but our main game was Vampire the Masquerade.
Oh,
so
nice.
Everyone's vampires, and it's like a horror game. And that's how I got into it. I was like, this is the one I want to do because this is horror. And I do remember making up sequences for my friends and them getting really freaked out. But I was sort of just trying to like, figure out a vibe and atmosphere and build on that. But at the same time, when I approached those games, I would like, that's the risk of tabletop games. You put it like a ton of work and planning and, I'm going to describe or make maps of this area. Then the players are like, we don't want to go there. We don't want to interact with that at all. Because I do think that when I approach things, I am a little controlling. So like and that approach goes to comics where I can control everything, especially the comics that only the comics that I write and draw myself and can plan out myself. I am like very controlling about how the pages go and how the page turns go and all that kind of stuff. And so that if the end result is that they come across as flowing, that is ideal. Like I don't want them to come across as like, clenched or tight, because that is what's a lot in the background is me like really trying to figure out like the pathways and like adjust to create the illusion that it is all meshing together.
There's a sequence in A Guest in the House, and I can't talk about it because it's late in the book, but it takes place in an attic. I'm going to say that.
Yes.
And that sequence, first off, freaky. So terrifying. And
thank
the way
you.
that you did the page turn in that, and like literal, there's a character turn that leads into a page turn where the perspective completely shifts and it turns into a double page spread. Mm-hmm. I was reading that in bed and I like instinctively reached out and grabbed my wife. And she was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I love you. I'm definitely not scared right now." And it is interesting though, because it's like you can look at that and you can see the turn of the character leading into the attic, leading into the next panel where that character leaves. And that is like, it's basically a direct line of flow. And it's really interesting. I don't know if I'm reading too much into this right now.
No, that's wonderful to hear. That's great to hear. You talk about like that it is preceded by, like, again, I also don't want to talk too much about that aspect of it because I don't want to give anything away, but like that character turn and then the page turn. I hadn't even consciously thought about that, I think, until you said it. But then when you said it, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that is what that is what I was doing. But like for me, it's just because I'm not talking to anybody else while I'm doing it. It's just like feeling it out. And I know that in horror comics, you don't have, or comics in general, unlike horror movies, you can't control time.
Right.
Like that's difficult. So like the page turn is sort of one of the few things you have to create that tension, or like the closest approximate like jump scare that you could have or reveal. So like page turns are like very important to me, going back to like the control thing, which is too bad because I often get like in the weeds about where the page turns are. So like even in this book, I had to go back and add sequences to like pace out my page turns later on because I hadn't like mapped them out correctly. But usually when I'm mapping out like pages, I will put thumbnails in like a tiny file so that I can like put them all as spreads, even if they aren't double page spreads, so that I can track page turns properly, because that is one of the main things I try to use.
Yeah. I mean, I actually just did a feature on my site about the art of the page turn and about like the necessity of that and how it's like the only way you can kind of hide information. And it's like the only way you can kind of keep something back from the reader. And, for you, it's very fortunate for, like, I mean, in some ways, with graphic novels, there's not going to be an ad in the middle of it. But I was talking to a lot of people who write single issues, and they're like, you might write this amazing page turn and you turn and it's an ad for like the Super Mario Brothers movie instead of this amazing page turn you cultivated.
Yeah.
That's got to be one of the most infuriating things. But it is such a powerful tool, especially when it comes to horror stories, because like you're saying, it's like it's the closest you can get to a jump scare when you don't have the varying senses being kind of engaged at the same time.
Yeah. And like even just like how in comics you can go back and check things easily. Like in movies, that's more difficult because you have to rewind and find the spot. But in like comics, you can just flip back and be like, okay, so that's what that character said. Like so that also makes it difficult. I think in this book too, I tried another thing. I don't know if this succeeded because one of the copy editors was very confused by it. But there's a sequence where I tried to hide a character in the, what do you call it? Like the gutter, the central gutter of the book. I wanted to make her like not visible in it. You can only see the edges of her body it's a double page spread. And they were like, this isn't going to be visible like once the book is actually bound. And I was like, no. Trust me, that's what I wanted. I know it sounds wrong, but
it's even cooler that way.
Yeah, but like it could just look like a mistake. But I guess that's the risk you take. Yeah.
Going back to something you said that you didn't know the rules of comics going in. Like that wasn't something you were super familiar with. And I specifically wanted to ask about conventions of comic storytelling because a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what comics should be. And some people are pretty rigid about those. It's like, there's 22 panels that always work. There's this, there's that. And those are great. It's good that those are that. But one thing I really like about all of your comics is that it's not that you don't know the rules. It's just you don't seem particularly concerned about the idea that comics should be any one thing. Like your comics just feel like you having fun doing what seems right to you rather than what has been right before. Is that the case? Like how much of your approach to storytelling is just you having fun and taking your stories where it seems like they need to go to you as a storyteller?
Yeah, no, completely. And like when I talk about like I didn't know the conventions or rules, that is all completely my own baggage. I have like issues with, like I say, control and perfectionism and all this kind of stuff. So I just didn't want to like make something that was bad or like mess up when I started, like make a fool of myself making comics. Even though, like I say, I've been reading different comics since I was a kid, I obviously absorbed the rules of how comics are read and how comics are laid out and made. But I had somehow created this idea in my mind that there was a way to do it and I could not do it. Like one of my major sticking points in not wanting to make comics was that like I couldn't draw, and I don't know why I thought this was an issue. I couldn't draw characters consistently across panels. I thought all characters, like sort of, because I went to school for animation, I thought all characters had to be on model exactly. I had to be able to rotate them perfectly in 3D space in order to draw. So when I first started making comics, one of the things that really freed me was I'm not going to care about that. I'm going to make this character blonde. And that will be the only thing that you can like track from panel to panel. Her anatomy can change, her face dimensions can change. All that can be different. But, as long as we got the general look of the character, same costume, whatever, we'll know it's her. I think doing that, like purposefully trying to make mistakes approaching something helped ease me up on it. And at the end of the day, like I do think that there are certainly obviously things you can do in comics to make your comic more readable, but I was not giving myself credit enough for the stuff that I had absorbed from a childhood of reading comics. So when I approach things, I sort of think about what format I'm going to put them on first. Like I say, I started doing webcomics because it was just easier. I could do it all myself. Like I didn't have to rely on like a printer. I didn't have to do any of that stuff. I initially started posting them on LiveJournal. This is in 2010. And then I moved to my own site because I couldn't control the canvas of LiveJournal enough. I wanted the comic, this is His Face All Red from 2010. I wanted that to be on a black background, and I couldn't do that on LiveJournal. So I was like, okay, well, I need to make my own website so I can put it on a black background. And so there's a lot of things that like the format of the comic informs the comic itself. And so I used to really like webcomics because I could do whatever. But like now I do really like doing print comics, or even like webcomics that are in print form or print dimensions, just because like it's fun to play around with whatever the form is. But like, yeah, I try to not let myself get worried about whether I'm doing it correctly or not. If I can show it to somebody and they can understand what's happening, then that's it. That's good. It doesn't matter about like, I know people get like, your narration box has to always be in like this corner of the panel, and you could ever put these sorts of panel layouts together, and it's like, you see people breaking that all the time, and it's fine.
Absolutely. Well, and I think your webcomics work is really interesting in that regard. Not just like your early webcomics work, but like you did A Pretty Place and Writhe, which is a mentioned beforehand, a Bloodborne fan comic that you did this year. And like those could not be any more different. One is literally a PDF that you can download. And then the other one is basically a choose your own adventure where you choose a different room in a house and it takes you to a different place, and then you get a narrative within there, and then you go back to the main house. And it's interesting to see that. And then like the 3 you made in 2014, the whole that the Fox did make, When the Darkness Presses and All Along the Wall, where one is like, they're completely structurally and formally different. There's one that's like 4 like-size horizontal panels, 4 like-size panels in a grid, and then a vertical scroll one. And it just kind of seems like, I don't know. Do you enjoy experimentation?
I don't know if I do as much anymore. Like,
okay. That was exhausting.
But I guess that I did do A Pretty Place just this year. But that was because like I've been dealing with a bit of like just block or burnout, because I started that last year, and I was like, well, I'm just going to draw stuff that I like or that I have fun with. I like drawing floor plans. I'm going to make a comic based off a floor plan where you can just click around and go to places. And I like drawing like weird houses. So like we'll do that. And Writhe, the Bloodborne comic, was just that I played Bloodborne and got obsessed with Bloodborne. And I was like, oh, I would love to draw a bunch of like characters from Bloodborne covered in blood. That's so fun and like soothing to me to draw, these big gory 2-page spreads. But talking about When the Darkness Presses, I was thinking about that recently within this conversation when you mentioned people doing single issues and having ads pop up in the center, because the idea for that comic came from, at the time, webcomics and like a lot of sites that had webcomics, obviously you have like all these ad bars because you're making revenue on your site. So you'd be reading like some tense comic, but there would be like an animated banner next to it of like some cartoony kids comic or something like that. And just like that juxtaposition, I was like, I kind of want to use that for a comic, and I'll make my own fake animated banners that look like ads that can then transform over the course of the comic.
Are you telling me I can't buy Aloe Glow?
You can't buy Aloe Glow, yeah. Unfortunately, you'll have to miss out on that one.
That's too bad.
But yeah, so like that kind of stuff, like I wanted to just like, play with that convention of webcomics at the time. But again, like control it completely myself so that like I don't have ads, and I just like can make my own.
I don't know why, but the idea that you really love control with this stuff, but you also love drawing floor plans, I don't know why that just adds up in my head. It's like something that's very structurally logical that you can recreate over and over. I will say you are very good at it. Those rooms looked really good.
Oh, thank you very much. That was actually, I will thank my wife for that. My wife is a 3D games artist.
Mm-hmm.
So every time I need like a room or a space, I'll be like, can you create like a 3D, like just like a rough version of this room that I can rotate and like work out the perspective on? Because like I have no patience for perspective, honestly, really. It's like math. I can't wrap my head around it. So she will make like rooms for me, and then I will, maybe mess with them a bit in clip or whatever I'm drawing in, and then draw over top of them. But she's been a big help in me doing weird room stories.
It's funny how those complementary skill sets from significant others can really help out quite a bit. My wife's an architect, and she's like very good at a lot of things, and it's shockingly helpful in a lot of ways no one would ever realize, but I do.
Sure.
And I'm very appreciative for that.
Yeah, like the attic you mentioned in Guest in the House, she built that attic. I was like, I want it to look like this, and then she made the attic so that I could rotate it on her computer and like pick the angles I wanted, because it's all like, the slats and stuff.
It's funny, the double page spread, when I looked at it, I was like, because it's kind of sort of, the camera's like outside of the room.
Yeah.
And it's, when I looked at it, I was like, this is so much more like 3D than I'm used to for your work. And it works really well. But I remember reading that and I was just like, this is such an interesting perspective for Emily.
Yeah, it's like, it's really hard to like move the camera, quote unquote, around in your head when you're making comics, and like realizing that's sort of what you want to. I just ran into this actually on a story I'm working on now, that I had thumbnailed out a certain angle that was just not physically possible within the realm of the room, because there was like other objects in the way, and I was like, well, it's comics, I can move that out of the way, or I can cheat this a bit or something like that. But yeah, I get overwhelmed with interiors and environments, so it's good to have somebody who can tell me how space works. Yeah.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Summer is in full swing and things are getting hot on Zoop. August is the time for mini launches, including, ironically enough, the book called August by Benjamin Morse. Also, an anthology from Stack Deck Press, Tony Gregori's Pork Chop Robot Killer, and the end of Glenn Bray's scrapbook campaign. And around the corner in September is Howard Chaykin's first foray into crowdfunding. There's so much more on the horizon, so stay tuned for updates. It takes less than 30 seconds to sign up for Zoop, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, the creators appreciate your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. I did want to ask really quick about, you mentioned about how you did a Pretty Place and Ride, at least in part because it seemed like an escape to some degree. It was like something you wanted to do for yourself. Is that kind of, you hadn't done a webcomic in I think 5 years before then, or at least released a webcomic.
Yeah.
Is that something that you kind of look at as something you can kind of turn to as like, I don't want to, kind of like a reward for yourself, like something where it's like pure control, all you?
Yes, yeah. And especially with the Bloodborne comic, it's extra fun because it is a fan comic. So it's not really for anything. I'm not doing anything with it.
Right.
It's like just like purely for fun. I was just doing some Bloodborne fan art like 2 days ago that was really like finicky and details that I was like, I had penciled it out. And then I was like, my Saturday was going to be, my gift to myself was going to be inking this like gory fan art and like rendering, gore and goo and tentacles and whatever else. Like that was like a treat for me to do and just sort of get lost in. So like when I set up for myself, like things like the Bloodborne comic, like, I'm still thinking comic wise, like I want to know how this works and I'm plotting this out, and that there were certain things that took a long time to figure out. But at the end of the day, it's just like something fun and soothing for me to draw, that where the stakes are like so low, And so like, but at the same time, like if I'm in a block with like other like actual writing or art or things like that, I at least know like this is a way to keep myself drawing and keep myself remembering how to draw and ink and experimenting, I guess. Like there was like, I think in that comic too, I used like a bunch of different brushes and things like that I hadn't used before. So
in the Bloodborne one?
Yeah. So like I was like, I can transfer some of these skills over to future comics. I can draw in this style or use this type of effect.
I have a very hyper specific compliment for that comic.
Oh, please.
I really enjoyed the different colors for the lettering for each character.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
It was very nice. When I realized what was happening, I was like, oh, this is really smart. Good job.
Oh, thank you for noticing that.
I did want to ask about an interesting wrinkle to this, because you have been doing more, when you're doing webcomic stuff, it's just you. You don't have anybody to like run by. With A Guest in the House, it's first second. You're working with Callista Brill. You're working with copy editors who are like, no one's going to see this in the middle of the book. Like it's going to be lost in the gutters. And you're like, I want to do it. How does that affect the control side and the side that wants to kind of play with conventions? Does working with an editor impact your natural instincts, or does it just kind of help you tap into those?
Well, I sort of talked to them at the beginning. The editor I was working with the most was Chiara Valdez for second. And she was great about letting me have my weird process. For my next book, I'm trying this differently because this is maybe too much work. But how I usually approach comics is how I approach my web comics and things that I do for myself is that I will write the opening section and then I will go to finished art right away.
Whoa.
On the opening, on whatever sequence I'm doing, because I want to know what, I guess, the limits of my mechanical skills are, or like how I can actually realize the thing that I'm imagining in my head. Like I need to know how it looks, because again, that form and those abilities will impact how I tell the story. I mean, it's not the best way to go about it because I do it in chunks, and also it means I end up throwing out a lot of pages.
Sure.
And that's fine. Like that's a thing I'm willing to do because I have to like sort of suss out how I want to approach something or how I want to draw something. And it just like at a certain point, I'll realize like I will have unlocked what it's supposed to look like. The initial sequence of the opening sequence of A Guest in the House, there's like a knight and a dragon. When I drew that knight, I was like, okay, I got this. Like I know how this is supposed to look. This knight looks like this. But the dragon sequence, I had a different version that got thrown out, a different opening to like the reality sections that got thrown out. But like I say, like I just needed to know like how it might look in motion. Like I can't just do character designs and then like be like, and they will look like this in the comic, because like I say, I don't really worry too much about characters looking super consistent across things. Like I need to see what their acting will look like. So working with editors, I did tell them like, I will just draw this book. I will give you updates on it throughout it. But I will draw the book and I will like show you as I'm going. And so we would talk about it as we went, but I sort of just drew the whole thing. And then we did edits on it. And so I ended up like taking out a bunch of pages. We ended up adding in a bunch of pages. And like I say, like I am fine with doing that, because even if I spend a lot of time on, I don't get super precious about like the artwork. Like in Through the Woods, I think there were like 40 pages that got cut ultimately, like finished pages.
Like you did them and then you threw them out and redid them?
I didn't redo them.
Oh, okay. You just tossed them.
Yeah, I just tossed them, like colored ink, like lettered pages that just like weren't working ultimately. And then in some cases I redid them, and there were some cool sequences and stuff. But like at the end of the day, like if they don't serve the story, then I don't really care. Mm-hmm. But like, so the new stuff I'm working on now, I'm trying to like actually like pencil it all first, and then show it to people and then go back and whatever. But I sometimes feel like I can't get across how successful something might look until I add all the color and inks and lettering. I can't like communicate exactly what I'm trying to do. So like, and then like in my webcomics, that's also how I approach them. Like a bunch of my webcomics have sequences that I like completely threw out, and I just like, it's just a series of like passes over it until it gets finished. A Guest in the House, at least I knew the whole story going in. So like everybody knew what the story was going to be. Yeah, I was sort of feeling it out as I went, because also like I get, when you're working on something, especially something long, like I always think of it as like, it's like cooling on the plate as soon as you put it there. And like, I want to like work on it as fast as possible while it's still hot. And if I leave it too long, it will just like cool and melt, and I won't be able to make something out of it. So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I mean, it's interesting that you're saying this, because this was something I wanted to talk about anyways. Before we do that, I'm going to do a quick spiel about what A Guest in the House is, because we're going to talk about that from here going forward. It's your soon-to-be-released graphic novel from First Second. Here's the solicit. After many lonely years, Abby's just gotten married. She met her new husband, a recently widowed dentist, when he arrived in town with his young daughter seeking a new start. Although it's strange living in the shadow of her predecessor, Abby does her best to be a good wife and mother. But the more she learns about her husband's first wife, the more things don't add up. And Abby starts to wonder, was Sheila's death really by natural causes? As Abby sinks deeper into confusion, Sheila's memory seems to become a force all of its own, ensnaring Abby in a mystery that leaves her obsessed, fascinated, and desperately in love for the first time in her life. First off, needless to say, based off of my tone so far, I absolutely loved it. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much.
It also is one of the only books I've read in recent memory that immediately made me want to read the entire thing again, because I was doing a lot of the flipping back and forth, but also wanting to go all the way to the beginning just to make sure. But the thing I wanted to ask about, actually, before we get into like origins or anything like that, is we talked about how you have the, very flowy pages, these pages that seem like you think of holistically and everything like that. And it's interesting that you say that you can't, just showing somebody pencils is going to be showing them like, I don't know, like 1/10 of what the page is going to end up looking like. Yeah. Because it seems like coloring and lettering are such essential parts of your process. I'm curious as to like how your process works from like start to end. Like, did you give for a second a script, or was it just like, this is the idea? How does all of that work? I know it's a lot.
I don't write scripts out beforehand. Mm-hmm. So no, I didn't. I gave them the whole story, and I gave them the first few sequences.
Like laid out, or like thumbnails or something?
Finished art.
Oh, okay.
Like completely done. Which again, like I went back and changed, but like I was like, this is sort of the goal, and this is what's going to happen in it. But like, because of my process, like I work out of order, or on this book, I worked out of order on certain scenes. Like if I felt stuck on one scene, I'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to go forward and work on this scene. So like a lot of the fantasy sequences I did early on, they're also the most fun to draw. So like I wanted to work on those because I want to get like the color and look of them, because that would also sort of inform the reality-based sequences. Because I'll say, like, for people who haven't seen the book, there's these big full-color neon fantasy sequences that are juxtaposed with black and white sequences that take place in mundane reality.
And you use like washes and some like tones and stuff with that?
Yeah, like it's all drawn on the computer via tablet, etc. But like it's I just have like a library of like pencil and washes and to fill in things. I don't really do scripts in advance because like I just change them too much. Like I don't like anything being like too set in stone. I like to be able to like move things around, or like I would read through a certain sequence of this book and think, no, like this is moving too quickly. I need another sequence here where we add this in. Or I need them to have a conversation about this because I've decided I want to add in a reference to it, 100 pages later. So like it's hard to know when exactly it's done, because I'm always going back and like pulling things out or like adding things in to set up stuff later on. So it is all drawn out of order. And then at a certain point, you're like, okay, this gels.
I have like the most bizarre comparison to make. Have you seen Ratatouille?
Yes.
You know the scene where I forgot her name. Janine Garofalo's character is about to like take the dish out to Anton Ego at the end of it, and like Remy takes his spoon and slaps it in front of her hand because he's like, it's not done, and he runs up and puts like a little like mint leaf or something on top of it, and then they take it out, and it's I kind of feel like that's you, where it's just like, no, I gotta get my little leaf down there just to make sure, like then it's done, then I know.
Yes. And like at a certain, it's like the thing that nothing's ever going to be done, right? There's always stuff you want to like fix or go back on. And at a certain point, you just have to be like, okay, just get this out of my life. I can't have this. I can't be picking at this anymore. So like this book, I finished it like 2 years ago.
Oh yeah.
So at this point, I'm like, oh, there's tons of stuff I would have done differently in this book, but whatever, that's for the next time. And that's just the nature of making art. Right.
Yeah.
But like, like I do get fussy, I'll say.
Okay, so I'm going to say this, and I mean this in a compliment. It might not sound like it. It shows in the work in a good way. But it is funny, though, because like I talk to a lot of people who say that they hate going back to look at their work because it's just like all you can see is the mistakes. I imagine that's kind of you to the max, because I mean, not just because like,
no, you're correct.
Because it's like you're looking at each aspect and it's like, oh, what if this lettering was moved like this, or what if this color was slightly turned? Because you look at it so holistically. It isn't just like, I really wish I'd phrased that better, or I'd really wish I'd drawn this with a little stronger line. It's like any aspect could be slightly askew and it just destroys the page for you, I imagine.
Yeah, I don't look back at old work. Really, I just decide not to.
I'm just not going to show you any pages.
Yeah.
At what point do you start considering lettering and colors and how they'll all fit in? Because it's like, I can't imagine that you're just like, I'm just going to jam this in somewhere.
Yeah, no, immediately,
Yeah.
right away. So like I think when I first started making comics, I changed the way I write my handwriting because I didn't my handwriting just didn't look good for handwriting. So like I changed how like I drew like B's and S's because I wanted to make them look more spindly or scary or something for comics. And then now every time I approach a comic, one of the first things I want to figure out is what the colors will be and what the lettering will be. Lettering for this one took a while because basically I have this thing where sometimes when you just use a font for lettering, for me, I don't. It never occurs to me with other people's art. Other people's art, I don't notice, or comics, I don't notice it at all. But for me, I always just like see the lettering just like sitting on top of my art in a way that it doesn't feel united. Like it always jars me.
Sure.
So I always want a hand letter, but at the same time, like that is so much more work and it makes editing so much harder. So like for this book, I futzed around for a long time and I finally found a font that worked, but I drew over that font in Photoshop so that with the same pen I was using to ink the book, so that there's like it's a bit scruffier. It doesn't look as like even and yeah, so like that took a long time.
So this is a modified font.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's not. I drew it all.
Oh, okay.
But like it was based on an actual font that I bought online.
That is so badass.
I mean, it's not like again, this like I feel like the way I make comics is a bit laborious. I would like to figure out a faster way to do them. But at the end of the day, my favorite part of making comics is the actual like drawing and fussiness part of it.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily having the product at the end. So like that's sort of relaxing. Doing the lettering is sort of relaxing. And then, you know, for certain bits of lettering, I probably in this one I did like just like with a dipped nib pen lettering. And for a certain character's speech bubbles, I did my own handwriting so that they would have a unique voice, I guess, to their text. And like, but like little things like that, like I say, like it never bothers me in other people's comics, but for me, for some reason, I just like I stopped believing the reality of my comic. I see like a font that doesn't quite work or colors that don't quite work, or in the case of this is sort of tangential, but in the case of Abby, the main character of this comic, I was having such a hard time figuring out how she looked when I first started trying to draw it because I just couldn't take her. I couldn't take her seriously because she was a cartoon I was drawing. So I was like, she just looks like a cartoon. Like I was like, I can't draw this person realistically enough or whatever. And I realized that the issue I was having was that every time I tried to draw her eyes, she just looked wrong. Like her eyes just looked wrong. And so Abby is the only character in the comic who has just circle eyes. I gave her like just like Little Orphan Annie circle eyes, which is extremely cartoony. But for some reason, it allowed me to take her seriously and see her as like a person. And also, she's the only one who has those. And it's the same. She actually kind of looks like a girl version of the character from His Face All Red. That's who I sort of based her on, is that guy.
It's funny. I reread Through the Woods preparation for this, and one of the things that actually kind of stood out is like there's that, but then there's also it's like in some ways like A Lady's Hands Are Cold kind of hits similar territory to some degree.
Yes.
And it is kind of interesting to see that, where not that you were repeating beats, but you're like kind of exploring things in like different ways. But it does seem like you have a lot of interest in domestic life and the horror that can come with it. In varying time frames, varying eras. Yeah. What makes that such a draw to you as a storyteller?
In this book, I was thinking about, you know, as I was thinking about doing this interview, what my influences were for A Guest in the House. And the two main ones, well, there's a few. You mentioned A Lady's Hands Are Cold, and that's like my version of a Bluebeard fairy tale myth. And I love Bluebeard stories and Robber Bridegroom and all those. Those are my favorite fairy tales because they can get so gory and weird. And so I wanted to do something like that. And then the other two influences for this one is obviously Rebecca, the Daphne du Maurier book. It was influenced by that because it's similar. You know, husband has dark secret. What happened to Rebecca? And Rebecca seemed so cool. And then the other major influence was a book called The Jest of God by Margaret Lawrence, this Canadian author. It's this book from the 60s about a woman who is in her early 30s in a small town. She's a school teacher. She's a virgin. And it's about her first sexual relationship, but also her relationship with her mother, her aging mother. And also she has these fantasies that start capping the chapters that are like these sort of elaborate sexual fantasies and very Baroque. And so that was the major influence, I think, was that like, from Rebecca, I take the Rebecca aspect and whatever, but A Jest of God really got me thinking about like juxtaposing like big Baroque fantasies and a very mundane, quiet person who contains these images in their mind. So yeah, so I don't think that really answers your question, but but those are the two main ones that did it. But like certainly there's a haunting aspect to all that to me that I guess I navigate through my comics and the characters within.
I don't think anybody who ever read this comic probably made the connection, but I read that his face all red was partially inspired by reading a story about like a bottomless hole, basically.
Oh yeah,
and so
yeah.
like you had this story that you want to tell about these brothers, but you're like, oh, how am I going to finish this off? And you're like, oh, bottomless hole. And
I think it probably started with hole. I don't.
Oh,
I
did it start with the hole? Okay.
I don't know.
But I mean, that's the funny thing though about storytelling, right? Is like sometimes it's like kind of marrying ideas together and finding the one great idea in there. And it's not even something as like, cynical as just like, I'm going to read stuff so I can jam it together into like some sort of weird like transformer thing.
Yeah.
It's like, finding inspiration where you find it. I did want to ask about Abby though, because she is a very interesting lead in the sense that in a lot of ways, it's like she is like, she's kind of trapped in this life. Like I don't know. I don't even know how to explain her. It's like you kind of have to read her to understand her, but there's a lack of enthusiasm for the non-colored parts of her life that she has. Yeah. What makes Abby such an interesting lead to you?
Oh God. Yeah, I guess just somebody who seems so unassuming on the surface and also is just so disconnected from reality, including the reality of like her own body. I think a lot of the stuff she does because she thinks that's how things go. Like that's why she gets married, because a guy asked her to marry her.
Right.
And she's like, okay, well, I don't have the other people in my family now. I guess I'll do that. But just somebody who like hasn't interrogated their own desires at all and their own life, because they are so connected instead to an extremely dense fantasy world and fantasy life that they can retreat into at all times. I mean, obviously, I relate a lot to this. I'm not like her in many, many ways, but in those sorts of ways, I think throughout my life, I have been maybe disconnected to myself because I have such a like imagination or places I go, especially when I was a kid. Same thing with Abby. But yeah, I just wanted to like investigate a person who was trying to sort out the nature of reality and desire, I guess. I was thinking too about like how other characters I've had that are like this. And I realized this is, like you say, this is a type that has come up before in my webcomic. I think the main two ones that are like her. Well, one is the guy from His Face All Red, I think is very much like her. Again, that's somebody who's not facing his desires or his feelings, it's his jealousies, resentments towards his brother. And then I have another webcomic on my site called Out of Skin, which is about a woman who lives by herself in the woods, and her house starts transforming into bodies. That she is definitely a predecessor of Abby. Again, that she is somebody who is not addressing her own desires or dreams, and she is putting them all onto jealousies of other people. And then the other one is Stacy, the woman from another webcomic on my site, Some Other Animals Meet. That is another character who is, as per the title, completely disconnected from her body, and she talks about the unreality of waking life and the vividness of dreams. So like that is definitely a through line. I think of them all, and then like Abby is sort of the culmination of all those characters. Because like I say, it's influenced by like Rebecca's whole thing, or not Rebecca, the second Mrs. De Winter, the main character of that book. Her whole thing is that she feels so cowed in the shadow of Rebecca because she is worried that her husband still loves his dead wife, who seemed like a very cool, confident bisexual. She seemed awesome. And then when spoilers for a book from 100 years ago, but when she realizes that her husband does not in fact love Rebecca, he loves her, it's like a huge relief. Like that's what she was worried about. She wasn't worried about her husband being a murderer. She was worried about her husband still loving this guy or this woman. But her husband like sucks. Her husband sucks. So like I wanted to do a book where it was like, what if instead she realized she's sort of became enamored of this specter of the dead wife, and followed that, and her, latent desire sort of latched onto that instead. So yeah, certainly, I guess I hadn't really thought about it until I started thinking about like the origins of this book. That it is like there are a lot of characters in my past work who have this sort of, quiet tendency.
Not to add one more to the pile, but beneath the dead oak tree, like,
yes, yeah,
that
that's true.
that is definitely a character who wants what they don't have, even though what they have is better.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess better from a perspective. I mean, it's non-violent comparatively.
Yeah, there's like a lot of like guilt. It's like that like miasma of like guilt and desire, and because of that guilt, you don't want to acknowledge or recognize what you're actually feeling, and disconnection from the body. Like in this, I put in more like in Out of Skin or Some Other Animals Meat. There's like body horror, elements to it for sure.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. It's Bad Idea, and Bad Idea is once again doing something? They're telling you that only you can save digital comics from Amazon, as the Renegade publisher is kickstarting a new digital comic from David and Maria Lapham, Scorpio Steele, Bill Crabtree, and Dave Sharp called The Ends. They're describing it as a quote-unquote comic book masterpiece, with the whole endeavor even coming with a pro edition featuring work from other creators. Wait, Bad Idea is doing digital? I thought that wasn't their thing. You might be wondering. You were correct. But apparently, you are no longer so. The Ends is coming to Kickstarter, but also digital at some point in the future. Sounds like a bad idea. It also sounds like Bad Idea. We'll see what it entails when it hits, but Bad Idea, doing its thing on Kickstarter once again. And now, back to the show. Do you think that you have single-handedly impacted real estate prices in woods places? Just like in the woods, it's like down like -2% every time an Emily Carroll book comes out.
They seem great. It seems like a nice place. My wife would love to live in the woods.
Peaceful, and definitely not haunted.
Yeah.
Oh, God. It's very rough. But okay, a couple rapid fire things I want to hit up on.
Okay.
One thing, I take notes when I read book for the first time for an interview. Mm-hmm. One note, it was literally just an email to myself that just said the words, "Congrats, you made Bob Ross creepy."
Yeah, I forgot about that sequence. That was one of those sequences where, well, thank you. And that was one of the sequences where I was like, I need something in here. What can they be watching, or what can they be doing?
Yeah.
So
it was haunting. I was just reading this. I'm like, I can't look at Bob Ross the same. I don't look at Bob Ross that often, to be honest.
Sure. Yeah. To
but
be fair.
If I do see Bob Ross now, I'll just like, I don't like you as much anymore for reasons I don't know. The other thing I wanted to say was, I don't want to talk about the ending because obviously that it would be a horrible interview subject, but I will say that when I feel like I realized what was going on, first off, I did the back and forth thing, and then I turned to my wife again. She had a tough time when I was reading this book. I turned to her and I grabbed her and I said, "Oh my God." And she was like, "What?" And I'm like, "Nothing." Yeah. I got to keep reading. But it was just funny because, I'll be honest, I don't know if I 100% am certain as to where I stand on what happens in the ending, but it has this moment where I'm just like, I don't know, it's like The Usual Suspects when you realize who Kaiser Soze is, and I'm like, oh my God, what is happening here?
Yeah, like I wanted, like I think with my comics, I have a lot of ambiguous endings.
Yeah.
By design, and that's because I sort of want them to linger in that weird way. You know, people can have various degrees of success in their readings of them as it goes. I also want it to be that moment where you can like look back on the comics and have questions. Like there's a lot of like, you'll have to fill in the blanks on certain things. And I think that's sort of like, to me, it's fun. Again, mileage varies, but like I like leaving, because a lot of my like work is inspired by, actually the initial concept for this comic like was from a dream I had 10 years ago. But like I always want to like have that feeling of like when you wake up from a dream and you're like, ugh, like there's something still like lingering, bothering you, like just a vibe you feel for the rest of the day. And so like that's what I kind of want to go for with my endings, like having them a bit weird and ambiguous. But
I think some of the best horror stories are like that. It's something that fits horror well, in the sense that you go through this and maybe there's some level of finality, but it leaves you with this like taste in the back of your mouth where you're just like, I'm not sure about this. I mean, like one of my favorite horror movies, I don't know if you've ever seen The Descent. Have you ever seen The Descent?
Oh, of course.
I love The Descent. And there's like the interesting thing about that is there's two endings, and one is like super ambiguous and the other one is not ambiguous, and it's just like it's a jump scare, and like it's interesting where like you can kind of see like the impact of what an ending can do just in like one film, because there's two different endings, because they're like, I don't know if people are gonna like this thing when it's like this. And it is interesting where it's like there's a part of me that always wants these characters to be okay in the end, whether it's your books or whether it's other ones.
The Descent.
The Descent, precisely. But sometimes it's a lot more interesting when you don't know.
Yeah, and like also for them to not be okay. Like I know the two endings you're talking about, and obviously my preference is the
original ending,
grim, ambiguous original ending, which is a bummer. But like I sort of like that aspect of horror. I kind of like it when things are like bad at the end, because so many bad things already happen. Like there's no going back, there's no solving it. Like whenever I've talked about this in the past, I've sort of talked about how like in His Face All Red, for me, the central like horror aspect of it, or in any of these comics, is like his anger and like resentment towards his brother, or his unflattering feelings of jealousy and the fact that he kills him. Like that's a bit unsolvable. Like that's very difficult to like process, where if it's just like a monster, you can just like a werewolf, silver bullets, like, you know, like even it like in a story, it's not as scary. Like if I had to face a werewolf in real life, I'd be scared, but in a story, it's like, well, let's just solve it. I think sometimes what horror gets like in the weeds a bit, when they decide you have to like figure out like the rules of like, you know, the It Follows monster, and then, you know, figure out how we're going to trap it and kill it. Like that's not as fun for me.
Horror stories do love rules.
Yeah, and like, you know, I don't know. That's fine, I guess. But like I wanted them all to get out in The Descent, sure, but like it's at the end of the day, it's a movie and it's gonna be scary. So
yeah. Also, I want to say, rules are not scary. How is that a thing?
When it's like a case of like, oh, I follow X, Y, and Z, and then I can kill the monster, or I can succeed, or I can break the curse, or whatever, that's not as scary to me. Because like what's scary to me would be thinking, oh, what if I mess up and I fuck up the rules and I can't, you know, like what if it's my own failure that causes me not to do the rules correctly and then I fail. Like that's a bit more interesting to me. So again, it all comes back to like personal concerns about capability and such.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, in terms of just like rules of something I'm not as into, but I'm sure there's something I could think of that I would love them in.
I say that, but bizarrely, despite the fact that there's just been so much of them over the last like 15, 20 years, I find vampires to be very scary, despite the fact that What We Do in the Shadows has tried very hard to make me not afraid of them, in the sense that they have very specific rules that like people would mess up all the time, which would put my own life at peril. I guess like in some ways, maybe that's a theme for your books too, is like the horror in life is other people sometimes, or yourself.
Yeah, or yourself, or like just your own contradicting wants and needs, and what you're capable of or not capable of. Because I think that like for me, failing at things that are like important, like survival or something like that, can be very daunting and terrifying. But yeah, no, I love vampires too. I'd like to do more vampire stuff in the future for sure. Because there's also like various like types of vampire like lore and whatever you can take from. Like there's no hard and fast rules for vampires, you know.
It depends on which flavor you get. There's a lot of different flavors of them. Just a few more questions. One thing I wanted to bring up about this, I think this is interesting. So when I got sent, I think I was sent a press release for it a while back, and it labeled it an adult graphic novel, which I thought was interesting because I never really thought of your books as like aged in a way, especially because like horror stories, I think, I'm not going to say young people are the only people that like horror stories, because obviously that's not true. But I often think of like going to movies, like horror movies, and seeing like a lot of like teenagers who are really jacked about being scared. And that's the interesting thing about A Guest in the House, is even if its lead and her situations like skew maybe more towards the adult, it doesn't really, it feels kind of like anybody could enjoy it.
Yeah, that's, I mean, my approach, I think sort of I got on a track of doing like YA or children's stuff because of the influences of Through the Woods, which was my first book, was more like fairy tale, which lends itself to like a younger audience based. And the publisher was also a YA publisher, but all those stories in there, I mean, like a guy gets shot in the head, like in one of the first stories. But like all the stories in there, I never approached them from like the idea of like these are for children or these are for adults. I don't approach it that way at all. And I think part of it is because growing up, I was allowed to watch horror movies, like any horror movie I wanted. As a young kid, I could watch anything, often with my dad and older brother. I think like there's some movies that my dad would like cover my eyes or ears for, but usually for like anything that was like risque, like not anything violent. So growing up as a kid, I liked horror and I wasn't scared of it. Like I didn't have nightmares and whatever else. Some kids do, some kids don't. And so any of my books or any of my, people always say like, is it appropriate can I give this to an 11-year-old or whatever? I'm always like, yeah, sure. Like it's fine. Like, your kid, like, would they like this? Then like, yeah. So I've never really, that's never really factored in. And this book, like, I think anybody could read it. I think maybe a younger audience might be bored by certain sections because like it is like an adult character in adult life. But yeah, I don't think there's anything that I would be really worried about.
I mean, I guess for the most part, it's just like marketing purposes. It's for like librarians and booksellers.
Yeah,
and
I
stuff
think
like that.
so.
But
yeah.
Reading it, I was just like, man, like I feel like a lot of young people would be really jacked by like the haunting, like the ghost element, all this stuff like that. I did want to ask one thing I'm curious about with Through the Woods. Through the Woods is interesting because I love it. It's honestly one of my favorite comics ever.
Wow, thank you.
I think it's interesting because it was your first release in print, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like it has like a long shadow? Like it's something that like kind of carries with you, like in a lot of ways?
Yeah, for sure. It totally does. And also, it wasn't quite my first thing in print. I self-published a couple comics that are now lost to the ether that I sold at shows before that. But yeah, it was like my first book that I started working on, and it has His Face All Red, which is a webcomic on my site, but then the rest are all original. But yeah, definitely like when I see, if people are talking about like my style or like how I write or the kind of stuff I do, it's just Through the Woods stuff.
Right.
Like it's that vibe. And I mean, that's fine. People like the book, I'm very glad. But like, I don't really do as much fairy tale stuff anymore, at least not like this. It's like Guest in the House has fairy tale stuff, but it's dreamy. Yeah. So like, yeah, I do think people, when they think of me, think of like that kind of stuff. But in my work now, I'm moving away from it a bit. I'd like to like maybe try out doing some more realistic stuff for a while. But I've been doing that for a while, like, with the hand cream comic, Some Other Animals Meet, and that's from like 8 years ago or something like that. And a bunch of my webcomics from like 2015, 2016-ish are all take place in like a mundane reality with fantastical elements kind of sprinkled in, but they don't have like the same fairy tale cadence as that book does.
It'd be kind of funny if Beneath the Dead Oak Tree was the one that everyone like had the long shadow, because everybody would be like, why isn't Emily's comics rhyming anymore? I don't understand.
Yeah. I just sort of want to do more comics that are like those fox people or animal people. Like I would love to do that. Cause like I had another comic with like a cat girl in 2019, like vampire comic. And like, it's just, there's something so pleasant to me. I guess it's the same thing with like the eyes. I just can take them more seriously when they're animal people rather than humans. Like,
isn't it funny how that works?
Yeah, I don't know.
I totally get what you're saying, because it's like when I read the book the first time, I did notice Abby's eyes, because I was thinking the funny thing about it is I don't want to like overly stereotype Canadian cartoonists, but for some reason I started thinking of like Kate Beaton.
Oh, sure.
And I was just like, I don't know why this kind of seems like a Kate Beaton character in some ways. I didn't even really think anything of it because she just felt right, rather than like the other characters who have normal eyes. I mean, I get, and her husband mostly just has like glasses. Like you don't really like kind of see him very much. It's funny how that works. But all right, so the last question I have for you is about where you are now. You're often trying new things. You like doing stuff. You dug back into the webcomics world this year. You have your mini comics you've done, like with the one I've mentioned, Beneath the Dead Oak Tree at Shortbox. You have your graphic novels. You have a lot of stuff. Is it important for you as a person and as a storyteller to kind of stay curious and adventurous in the comic art form? I know you said that you're like trying to not, the experimentation isn't as attractive as it used to be, but do you enjoy finding new ways to push yourself as a storyteller?
Yeah, like I guess when I say like the experimentation isn't as important at this point, I'm just sort of looking for things that I will get excited about rather than just for like the novelty of trying out a new format or a new genre. I just need stuff that like I will have fun drawing. Like, that's what I'm saying, like with the Bloodborne comic or the Pretty Place comic. Like that's sort of where it leads me more. Like I don't have any grand design to it. I just want to have something that I will have fun. And again, like that's a lot of trial and error, right? Like you have to like figure out whether something will click or not. And I've been writing a bunch of stories and, like I say, penciling a bunch of stories, and I'm just sort of like picking away at things to see what like really like clicks for me. Yeah, like I just stay here in my dark office and try to suss things out. Just a very lonely pursuit. But yeah, I don't have any grand design or like special need to like do anything in particular other than just find something that I'm going to like for the sake of liking it. Because I know that, like I say, like I want it to stay hot until I can finish doing it. And if I approach it with anything other than just like a excitement to actually draw it, I know that will fall apart in the theory stage.
I imagine it would be a lot more difficult for you to kind of get into the kind of like the fussiness part of it and take joy from it if it's not something that you really want to tell. If you're like,
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, this isn't to say that you didn't enjoy the experience, but it's like you once did the art for a comic that somebody else wrote. And
a couple times, yeah.
Oh, a couple times. And so that's a dramatically different experience. And
yes.
Maybe with something like that, you're doing it because it's a job, not because it's something you love doing. And that's a bird of a different feather.
Yeah, no, completely. Like that is, you approach it differently because it's also somebody else's. So again, I don't have full control to make all the like, fussy controlling decisions I would like to make.
Yeah.
And like, or like argue about things like at length, because it's not just about like, making comics, no matter what the comics are. It's about making what I want to make and what I want to do. Yeah. Rather than just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Well, I fully embrace you taking on your passions because so far it's led us nowhere but good places. But Emily, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about A Guest in the House, all of your other work and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Emily Carroll. You can find her on our website at mcarroll.com and her work in A Guest in the House at First Second. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Christina Merkler, Andrew Lehman, Mike Hansel, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polges, Kevin Bides, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Dorade, Nir Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian, Subman Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Misell, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambank, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hall, Philip Myra, Chris Bachala, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julia Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Carl McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Stables, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.